All praises to the Most High for another day. Blessings to all the 12 tribes of Israel, and to all the Gentiles that will cleave unto the house of Jacob. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to continue reading the book of Remembrance of Enoch, the Essene book of Hagi. Chapter 13, Tablet of Bedal, the story of Enoch and Essene, an account of the return to Eden of Yatzakad and Kava, and of the division of the days of men. And it came to pass that after Enoch divided the sons of men according to the measure of the sanctity and holiness of marriage, the people of Mawin prospered, and for the first time the righteous children of Enoch became truly a people who were strong in their family bonds, and they walked together in community. And by all of the profound acts of dividing in the midst of creation, the righteousness and the dignity of the handiwork of Enoch began to gain the upper hand, and the reality of the value of acting with honor before one another and creation and the Creator became very clear in the hearts of the righteous. But the wicked were filled with a sense of dishonor, and they had to choose more and more clearly to associate themselves with the feelings of guilt and the perplexities of shame because of the divisions that were brought about by Enoch. And thus all of the souls in creation, both among the watchers and among men, found themselves subject to the truth regarding the purposes of the Holy Great One and the course of man and these divisions upon the earth. And it came to pass after those days that the Erkadeshi firmly laid claim to Yatzakad and Kava, for when all of the righteous together in the midst of the use of the element of righteousness identified them to the Erkadeshi as the perfect model of the fulfillment of the desires of Enoch, and that they were the object of their creation in the midst of the temporal world, the love of the Erkadeshi could not be constrained. And all of the watchers of holiness spoke to one another concerning them, and they kept track of them day and night, and they followed them and hovered over them like a mother bird with her young. And finally the forces of their yearnings and of their love for Yatzakad and Kava burst forth in quiet power, and Matzah the Lamb became the spokesman for the Erkadeshi. And in the night, in the dwelling place of Baraka, the Lord appeared, and he said to her, Baraka, my daughter. And she said, Lord, here I am. And the Lord said, Be not alarmed at that which I will say to you. My father longs to dwell once again with your old parents in Eden, and the call has gone out from the Erkadeshi, summoning them back home. Be not afraid, for they will heed the call, but rejoice, for their inheritance of Gabriel is at hand. And the Lord withdrew from before Baraka. And the Lord appeared also to others, and Essene and Adah and her children beheld him, and heard the same words as Baraka. And there were others who were visited by the Lord. And in the morning they all marveled at that which they had heard. And it came to pass that as they spoke of these things to one another, Azura and Sephi sent word for Baraka and Essene to come to them. And they also had a tale to tell of the visit of Matzah the Lamb to them. And they said, He came to comfort them, but they could not tell what it meant. And they were very old, and Azura could hardly see, and Baraka was kind to them. And she told them that with the division of the sons of men, using Yatzakad and Kava as the element of righteousness, the seventh generation was now complete. And the old woman told them that they now must let their old parents go, according to the covenant that Matzah made with them in the brook Baca in the valley of Joash. And they conferred together, and they all determined that they would say nothing to Yatzakad and Kava. But when the sun was up, the children reported that their old parents could not be found. And it came to pass that Mahujah set himself to see concerning them, and he found the signs upon the earth that they went eastward along the river bank. And when Baraka heard of it, she exclaimed that they intended to walk together to go all of the way to the oaks of Patak, and it was too far for them, and such a long journey was not safe. And she called for Amazadad, and Enoch and Mahujah showed them signs upon the ground, for they could not let them go without knowing concerning their welfare. And it came to pass that Amazadad gathered his band together, and they followed after them. And when they had their old parents in sight, they were discreet, and they did not let them know they were watching over them. And these strong men were amazed at how far they had traveled, and they determined that they must have left in the night immediately after the Lord visited the women of Beth Malah. And it came to pass that our first parents traveled on the south side of the stream called Simca, and they followed it until after some days they came to the branch in the river that came down from the encampment of Nod, and they could be seen moving carefully along with Yatsakad helping Kava as they went. Now in Beth Malah, when Azura heard the reports of the children, she went straight away to the dwelling place of her parents, and they were indeed nowhere to be found. And she found the Kelly of her mother, and it was in the usual place for it. And when she saw it, she fell down on her knees, and she held the Kelly close to her, and she wept. And she knew that if her mother had left her Kelly, she had indeed set out to return to Eden. For her mother did not anticipate fear to be in Eden, and she knew she would not see her again in this life. And it came to pass that the men following Yatsakad and Kava stopped each night and remained discreet in their watch care over their parents. And they found that they did not arise in the morning to travel on until the sun was well up. So the men became accustomed to be in no hurry to resume their travels each day, and they kept their old parents in sight all day long. And after many days they came to the encampment of Nod, and Yatsakad and Kava did not pause to stay the night there as Amazadad had supposed, but they went on. And the men settled into sleep at the borders of Nod. And in the morning, when they again took up to follow them, they found that they were already gone. And they hastened themselves forward, and they found their tracks went between the oaks of Patak, and their tracks were seen no more. And these men were hunters of very great skill, and they knew their signs upon the ground were no more. And I saw with Urim my dear old parents as they went, and it was a marvelous thing to me that they went so long with very little to eat, and yet in their old age they seemed to gain strength as they drew closer to the oaks of Patak. And it was just in the dimness of the first light of day that they arrived at the gateway to heaven, and the brilliance of the presence of Enoch lighted up their way. And I think I saw them to be younger, but I could not tell. And Enoch was sitting there leaning up against the northernmost oak, and it was plain that they expected him to be there. And as they approached, they slowed down, and they went forward gently, and Enoch arose to greet them, and he handed Kava a yellow rose, and they called him Father. And they took his hands, and they walked up the hill and out of sight. And at that moment the sun was seen to show itself to those of the east, and it was the first day of the year. And the son of Enoch was triumphant on that day, for the handiwork of his loving kindness returned to their father into Eden, out of the temporal world, in the full purity of the holiness of Elda. And it occurred because of the ability of Matzah the Lamb to forgive and to restore. And it was the fourth day of the week, because the fourth advocacy of our Redeemer was to join man with Enoch through element. And also because on the fourth day in creation, the gift Messiah gave his father was to overcome the struggles of life. And when they went back to Eden, They had indeed endured to overcome and to find their way back into the arms of their Father. And another gift Messiah gave his Father on the fourth day of creation in their behalf was the bread of life, and they had been sustained and protected and watched over until their return to Eden. And again, the third gift Messiah gave his Father on the fourth day of creation was the ability of Enoch to reveal himself to them. And it is plain that he accomplished it, for they found him fully and took his hands at last. And further, all of the sweet things Enoch had made for them on the fourth day of creation were richly fulfilled in their creation on the fourth day of the week. And the rocks of Simca, and the waters of the Aral Sea, and the grass of the Re of Kava, and the rose, and the oaks of Patak were all very well pleased. And these 5 things were created on the fourth day. And it was 279 years since they had left Eden, and they dwelt in Mawin with their children 9 years. And at the fulfillment of the covenant of Gabriel, all of the Erkadeshi rejoiced, and the love of Enoch was fulfilled in them fully. And the grasslands of Anak shook, and the grass swayed with gladness. And in those moments, the joy of it overshadowed any acts of the wicked. And although many of the children of men had died before this day, there was something in the lives of Yatakar and Kava that proclaimed complete fulfillment into the living souls in creation. And the example of their lives had a profound effect upon the Erkadeshi. For after these things, it seemed they were much more willing to abandon the wicked and to ignore their request. And it came to pass, after these things, Amaziyadad and his band returned home, and they rehearsed all that had happened. And many thought that their old parents had passed away like unto Shatan, and others thought they did not die, but passed straight into Eden. And in the days that followed, Abiathar passed away, and Seth, and all of the children of Yatsakad. And in these days the children of Mawin were taught the meaning of life and death, and the truth of Eden. And it came to pass that Azura and Sephi passed from this world, embracing one another, and their last words were heard to be their words for greeting their mother. And the years that followed, the people of Mawin grew and matured as a people, and they became very strong in their knowledge of the Lord and in their care for one another, and they became very skilled in their use of the element of righteousness. And the Lord taught them to weave cloth, and Enoch was strong in the Lord. And as the men of wickedness from the valleys of Heliah became more bold, Enoch sought ways to protect the people. And it came to pass that a large company of the wicked were seen to be approaching from the west toward the northern regions of Mawin. And Enoch viewed their approach from the top of a high place, and he prayed mightily to the Lord to save the people of the land. And the Lord said, "Get yourself down from here, for the Erkadeshi are mourning, and they are afraid." And Enoch went down away from the mountains and out upon the plain, and the whole of the mountains raised up from south to north, and the earth shook, and the dust of the movement of the mountains burst forth mightily and filled the lofty places. And the company of the men of Heliah were scattered in fear, and a strong east wind descended down upon them with the clouds of dust, and it was the first such a dust storm to be observed upon the earth since Yatakad left Eden. And a great dread came upon the wicked. And this event occurred when the wicked were conferring together to make their plans as to how to take the spoil from the people of Mawin. And from that day it was said that the ground would shake in Heliah if the wicked thought to come against Mawin. And this was also the first great and terrible earthquake since Yatakad and Kava left Eden. And from that day the wicked viewed the violent shaking of the earth as a sign to them that God would punish and destroy men according to his delight and pleasure whenever he chose. And the ignorance of the wicked concerning the mourning of the Erkadeshi over the sins of men was great. And the wicked durst not come against Mawin ever again, even until Mawin was fled. And it came to pass that all of these things happened after Yatsakad and Kava returned to Eden. And 100 years passed away, and the welfare and happiness of the people of Mawin grew in the abundance of it, and the people were blessed steadily as they learned to be virtuous, and to huddle together, and to put their trust in the Lord. And it came to pass in those days that a man named Shairi came into the land, and he was of the 5th generation since Enoch, and he was a goodly young man who walked with Matzah the Lamb, and he was a descendant of Methuselah, and he was a son of Shem. And he and all of his fathers dwelt in the land of Toah, near the borders of Heliah, because of the waywardness of Methuselah, and they dwelt at the headwaters of the Halais river, which is the same place where the brother of Jared stayed for the night, when Shema found her daughter, according to the writing of the brother of Jared. And this young man, Shairi, fell at the feet of Enoch out of his great love for him, and he called him father. And Enoch had compassion on him, and he taught Shairi in all of the ways of being a scribe of stone tablets. And the heart of Shairi was tender and pure, and he was called Shairi because he was a remnant of the family of Enoch that returned to him. And Shairi was a great comfort to Essene, and he rehearsed to her all of the doings of the people of her son Methuselah. And it came to pass that Shairi, who was also of the 5th generation from Enoch, took one of the daughters of Aphaf to wife. And the Lord gave Shairi a Urim and Thummim, and Barakah blessed it. And she prayed earnest prayers over Shairi. And he made stone tablets after the manner of those in the possession of Enoch. And he had correspondence with his father Shem. And he took the heavenly tablets to him, and stayed with him a while. And he instructed his father in all things concerning the tablets. And thus the water tablet found a way to go to Noah, the father of Shem. But it was called the tablet of Bedel by Enoch. And Noah used it to divide the earth according to the lives of men. And he did it with the waters of the great deep. And just before the flood, the people of Mawin were taken back to Eden, for Enoch said took them. And it came to pass that Shairi dwelt in the holy city until the 339th year of Enoch. And in that year he departed towards the south, beyond the borders of Rab Shalash. And no righteous man had gone before into that quarter of the land. And there he found a vast marshland to dwell in, that was much like the land of Mawin. And it had 2 rivers, and a salt water sea. And because the Lord had given him a Urim, they named the valley of the marshes the land of Ur. And any of those who had previously lived there had fled at the breakup of the society of Seku. And the people of Shairi were called the people of Ummah. And in the times that followed the flood, a people called the Chaldeans set upon them and took possession of their land, and made the people of Ummah their slaves. And the Chaldeans called Shairi Arphaxad, according to the manner of their own language. And it was in this way that Shairi became a remnant of the holy city of Mawin. And the children of this man were obliged as slaves to become the guardians of the idols of the Chaldeans. And the Lord took the Urim from Shairi for safekeeping, and no man knew what had become of it. And it was known that Shairi had seen by Urim a vast people who would someday come to dwell in the lands of Toa. And he prayed mightily for them, and he left tablets deposited in the earth. And because of the wickedness of men, they have been kept back from becoming known. Now before these days, during the 100 years after Yatsukad and Kava returned to Eden, the people learned how to organize themselves to perform their labors, and it was necessary for them to thrust themselves into their labors with vigor at certain times of the year. And it came to pass that Enoch was in the drying yard, where they dried fish, and he labored until he was exhausted. And he was in his 239th year, and Enoch slept in the drying yard in the midst of his labors, and Essene brought him food and comforted him. And at this season all of the people labored with much effort in order to provide for themselves. And it came to pass that in the night, in the press of these labors, the Lord came to Enoch as he lay asleep in the midst of the drying poles of fish. And he awoke Enoch gently. And Enoch said, Lord, I am here for you. And Matzah said, Enoch, will you come and visit with me? And Enoch replied, Lord, we are in the midst of our labors in the harvest, and the fish are brought to us in abundance. And the Lord said, you have more to harvest with me than all the fish in the sea. And Enoch stirred himself, and he said, O Lord, please forgive me. I will come to visit with you, as you have said. And at this time Enoch labored among the fishermen, who were known as the watchmen of Mowin. And it came to pass that in the morning, after Enoch had set his affairs in order, he gathered his listeners, and he went west to the altar of the Asupa. And after their arrival the next morning, the Lord approached, and he sat upon the ground, and the listeners took their positions. And the Lord spoke to Enoch tenderly in his heart. Enoch repented mightily for his hesitancy to come, and he could sense the matter at hand was very important to the Lord. And the Lord said, Enoch, my son, you have divided all of the sons of heaven, and you have identified those who love and those who hate, and you have been diligent to name them all according to my word to you. And you have safeguarded the names of the Erkadeshi according to all that I have told you. And again, you have divided the waters of Senir as to whether they be sweet or bitter. And in this way, you have brought into the lives of all men an inner knowledge of good and evil, insomuch that every person that is born can know right from wrong. And in this way, you have established the conscience of man. And you have divided the sons of men before the eyes of all of the Erkadeshi, and you have carefully instructed them according to the measure of the sanctity and holiness of marriage. And my father has observed all of these things that we have done together, and he has another need that weighs heavily upon him. And I have come to you this day to ask you to bless and comfort my father according to the tender desires of his heart. And I have called you here to instruct you in how you may divide the days of the lives of men. And Enoch said, I will obey and listen to all you will say to me. Lord, please teach me how to divide the days of men. And Matzah replied, Now then, I say to you, that beginning with the first day of the season of renewal, which you have named Chedashiel, you shall mark the first day of the year, and there shall be 4 seasons, and a season shall have 13 weeks, and a week shall have 7 days, to mark the 7 days of creation. And the first day of the year shall fall on the 4th day of the week, because on that day of the week Yatsukad and Kava passed through the oaks of Patak to return to Eden. Now understand that time came because of sin, but time did not come from sin, for it came out of the heart and presence of Enoch said, as a loving gift to man. And it came from the covenant that I made with Gabriel. For on that day I brought the desires of my father to be with his children, and I joined them with the desires of Yatsakad to be able to return to be with his father. And thus I established fully the pathway of man back to Enoch said. And time is a measure of the pathway back to Eden. And because both Yatsakad and Enoch said were holy in the temporal world, time became a living soul in the midst of the temporal world, to be numbered among the Erkadeshi, and her name is Adiel, and you shall see it, that she finds her place among the Erkadeshi. And Adiel is a temporal element, like unto all of the other Erkadeshi, for she lives in the light of the sun, and she lives in the heart of Enoch and in the others of the Erkadeshi, and in the passages and hearts of the righteous. And if you bring the knowledge and practice of Adiel to the righteous, it will be a great source of comfort to my father. For during the year there are holy days that are very memorable to him, and they are very dear to his heart, and each holy day represents some kind and wonderful intervention to relieve him of his burdens and sorrows and his distress of grief. And the division of the days of men will be a continual gift of tenderness to him from his beloved righteous children. And know certainly that during all the days of the earth, the wicked will not give heed to the dividing of days that are set in place to comfort my father. And every man is given the gift of time. And when all the children of my father who will choose to do so have completed their pathway back to Eden and have been transformed back into the natural world, time will be no more, but the soul of Adiel will remain to live in Elda in the presence of the Great Holy One. And the division of days of men is both a blessing for my father and for the righteous, for such days are for the righteous to have life in the flesh more fully. And by the division of days which they have been given, they can enjoy the treasure of the passages of Enoch said, and of their lives, and those of their children, and each moment is a time for happiness and for rejoicing for the gift of life. And the gift of life is a very great treasure, and time for the righteous is a rich gift indeed, for they can look upon their little ones, and on the charity of their women and children, and upon the valor and honor of their gentle fathers, and they can behold all manner of the sweetness of life, and they can share in the memories and fond moments of Enoch said, to comfort him and one another. And the righteous should arise each day with rejoicing for the gift of a new day. And each day must be seen to be an exciting new opportunity to walk with their Father, and to love one another, and to enjoy the life which they have been given. And the division of days is established to give order and purpose to your gift of life upon the earth. And when the wicked pervert the division of days, they know it not, but they are excluding themselves from the power of living life. And in this way, the division of the days of man will protect the righteous and leave the wicked without the means of enduring to find fulfillment. And they will seek endlessly for that which they cannot obtain. But to the righteous, the division of days is an element of righteousness to cause bonding with their Father and moments of refreshing in the midst of creation. And you will see that the division of days will support and sustain the four foundations of community. And the division of days will allow the Erkadeshi to participate more fully in important expressions of righteousness. And it will also be a great aid in your processes of repentance and purifications. And you will find that without the presence of my Father and his passages in your midst to share your processes as you live in community together, you will not be able to be of one heart and mind on matters that lay before you. And the living souls in creation will respect your labor when it is done according to this way that joins with the passages of their Creator. And thus your storehouse will overflow with richness and provision. But to the wicked, time is known among them as a curse, and they will be seen to never have enough of it. And because they are continually out of time, multitudes will deny themselves the delight of the passages of their children, and the children will cry and perish in their loneliness. And the wicked will divide their days to enable themselves to find the satisfaction of possessions and opportunities to magnify wickedness, and they will turn every holy day into a day of reveling in lustful and imbibing pleasures, and they will view time as bondage, for they will find days of obligation instead of days of opportunity, and they will dread any day that approaches wherein they must stand to account. But any day of accountability to the righteous is seen to be a day of fulfillment and satisfaction of a task well done. And this is so because my rich forgiveness can strengthen and restore and give new life and build confidence. And now, my son, you must divide the days of men according to this manner. The rising sun must be the beginning of your day, but the setting sun begins the day for those who work in darkness. And the course of the sun is to guide you in all matters of the division of days. And the wicked will use the moon, which they perceive, to rule over their deeds done in the darkness. And you will count the years of your life, starting from the day of your birth. And you must number the years of the course of your lives, beginning with the first day of the season, for the renewal of all creation. And each year shall have 4 seasons, and the weeks of the year shall have 7 days, to acknowledge the creating love of Enoch, which he accomplished in 6 days. And the 7th day of each week shall be a day of rest, which is called the Sabbath. And each season shall begin on the 4th day of the week, and it shall have a day at the end for a purification day, and it shall be a day of the week. And you are to use this day to prepare to receive the gift and blessing of the next season. And at the end of every year you shall cause a day to be for Enoch, and it shall not be a day of the week, but it shall be a day of the year only. And in like manner, every 4th year you shall observe an additional extra day after the day of my father, and it shall be a day for me. And you shall celebrate all of the holy days of my father, to do them according to his days of memorial, according to the delight of his heart. And you shall honor him and rejoice together with him, and be diligent to gently guide one another on each weekly Sabbath. And you shall rest from all of your labors on the Sabbath, just as my father rested on the 7th day, in his task to bring his love for you to be infinite. And your only task on that day may be to collect and to set in order your elements of righteousness. And you shall make nothing new on that day with your hands. And on this day I shall speak to guide you in all of your congregations, and all of the Ekadeshi will rest with you. And the Sabbath is a day to speak to one another and act in behalf of my Father. And all of the desires of his heart are to be promoted in the lives of one another on this day. And it is a day of richness in the love of repentance, and tenderness in the rewards of forgiveness. And the first day of your year is not a Sabbath, and it shall fall on the 4th day of the week, because on that day Yatakad and Kava returned to Eden, and the inheritance of Gabriel was fulfilled on that day. And 2 days before this day is a Sabbath, and your observance of the first day of the year is to follow in the likeness of the day Yatakad and Kava left Eden. And 2 days before they departed to leave Eden, they confessed to Enoch what had happened to them in their sin. And it is a day to abandon sin and to make sure determinations to walk uprightly before Enoch. And on the day of the new year, you are to anticipate the arrival of your father Enoch, and you are to acknowledge in your souls together your need to be forgiven. And on that day, you are to gently and with real intent and with true purpose of heart confess the sins of your life to one another and to Enoch said. And when this rich fellowship is completed, you are to wash in water from the brook of the meadow, and let each person wear wool on this day, and carry with them the he is worthy plant, so that the spirit of rich forgiveness may abide with them and linger in their hearts. And everyone is to have their hair up all that day, until you enter in to make your confessions, and your hair is to be an acknowledgement that this time you are not a victim of Mozart, but you have chosen to join your spirit with him in some way for which you will confess. And that night you are to prepare your place of rest to be fresh and clean, and you are to provide a pillow for Enoch said to rest his head upon as he sleeps with you. And on that day you shall have your habitation also prepared to be fresh and new, and you shall have a pillow of pure white linen that is made white in the light of the sun, and the pillow shall be filled with clean and combed wool, and it is to be placed in the middle of your resting place early in the day. And all is to be made clean and ready for Enoch said to come and sleep with you that night, and the pillow is for him to lay his head upon, and you shall make room for him in your resting place when you lie down. And if you are married, his pillow is to have an opening on both ends that are yellow, and he will sleep between you. And every man, woman, and child, wherever they sleep, will have a pillow for Enoch said. And the prisoner, and he who travels in the way, and those who seek their prey, and any who go to perform a task, shall find a place to rest with their father Enoch said on this day. And the domination of the wicked will not prevent the righteous from sleeping with their father. And if you are not married, the pillow shall be open on one end, and it shall be yellow on the open end, and it shall be laid on their glory side, with the open end towards the sleeping person. And the man and his wife shall inhabit the side of the resting place that is shown upon the heavenly tablets, the man being on the glory side and the woman on the power side. And this day is a Sabbath. And on the morrow, on the day of the Lord, all who are able are to prepare the skins of animals for clothing, and the women are to make clothing from them. And at the end of this time, the needles of the women are to be blessed and established in their rightful place as a sure possession of all the women in Moeen. And on that day, after their blessings, you are to all count your possessions before one another. And while the storehouse can provide you with things to use in your daily lives, only my father Enoch said can give you possessions, and you are to consider your possessions to be only that which he has given you, and everything else in your life you have only the use of it according to his kind provision. And this is so that the satisfaction of possessions will be far away for the inhabitants of Moeen. And on the following day, which is the first day of the year, you are to eat nothing whose blood has been shed, but you are to bring sheep with you in all of your comings and goings on that day, and they are to be present for the worship and fellowship of that day. And you must see that nothing brings them fear or dismay. And just as sheep followed with me when I went with Yatzakot and Kava out of Eden, so shall they go out with you on that day. For sheep and their wool feel the richness of my forgiveness, because I began to become temporal with man on that day, and the presence and the spirit of forgiveness shall abound. And everyone who is of age shall come before the altar before me, every man and woman, and shall put yellow paint upon their glory ear, to show forth their willingness to listen to the voice of Kai. who is sent to guide them in the way. And by this his voice will become clear in your hearts during your daily walk in the coming year. And they all shall have yellow paint on their glory thumb to show forth before all men and the Erkadeshi that they are willing to bless Anokised in the humble offering of their life in loving kindness. And they all shall paint their big toe on the glory side to show that they are determined to act out of loving kindness toward their fellows and to put forth their hand to support the visions of one another. And on that day the men of service shall hear from the people their longings and desires to walk in holiness of heart and to find fulfillment as they journey on the pathway back to Eden. And these men shall renew their determination to act in behalf of Anokised and his son, to bless the people in these holy desires. And they shall perform healings on this day according as I direct, even as I did for the finger of Kava from the thorn. And from the Sabbath until the first day of the year is over, let nothing pass into the lips of the righteous except by thorns or by drinking, so that the dread of you shall abound among their Kadeshi. And it came to pass that after Matzah explained the day of the new year, that he spoke to Enoch further. He said, since the council of heaven, where Anokised declared that he would go into the temporal world himself to rescue his children, the great Holy One was anxious in his heart, and he worried whether his children would love his son, and if they would respect him and honor his words and his pleadings in their hearts. For he knew that his son was their only way back to him. And as the righteous and the wicked among men began to divide in the midst of the earth, this question was before his face, and it seemed that all of the handiwork of his love was groping to find their way. And in the midst of this perplexity of Anokised, there came a wonderfully strong woman who relieved his anxiety to know whether his children would love his son. And it was on the day that Edra named the Aral Sea. And as Edra named the sea while standing in the water, this lovely one came, who is dearly beloved by Anokised, and it was Milo. And she was very strong in her determination and in her love for the Lord, and she had learned how to endure all the hardships of life. And in the midst of the multitude, she got herself upon a table of the fish yard, and as Edra spoke to the sea, she made great declarations to the multitude assembled, and her voice carried out over the water, and all who were present could hear her words, albeit they were not loud. And she is called Milo, because she has consecrated her life in full measure to give it to Matzah the Lamb. And she declared with a clear voice to all who were assembled the meaning of the living waters and the righteousness of the waters of Eden that were flowing into their land. And she expounded to them all the necessity of giving their lives to the son of Anokised, and she rehearsed to them the rich meaning of such an act of consecration. And after Edra made his appeal for the people to be baptized in the waters of the Aral Sea, she went into the waters first at the bidding of Edra, and she went down and came up out of the waters in like manner of the song of the dance, and the waters gently waved up and down together with her out of their delight. And it came to pass that all of the multitude followed her example, and they went into the water, and they clung to all of her exhortations to give their lives fully to Matzah the Lamb, holding nothing back. And it was known that the presence of Kai had prepared the way for this to happen. And in the midst of the exclamations of those in the multitude of their intent to give their lives wholly to Matzah the Lamb, all of Elda erupted into singing, and the sound of it reached into the soul of Anokised, and he was brought to comfort, and his longings were answered, that his children would choose to love his son. And that day became for Enoch a treasured day, which he marks every year as he lives with his children. And the day became known as the day of the measure of Milo, when the father was comforted by the richness of the gifts of the lives of the righteous to his son. And they gave in full measure, withholding nothing. And this day is very dear to the heart of Enoch. And it happened on the 15th day of the season of renewal. And again, it came to pass that Matzah explained a holy day to Enoch, and he said, I tell you these things, for in heaven, where the abode of the great Holy One is, there was concern that the righteous children of Enoch would have adequate support to sustain them, seeing they were in the midst of the 1/3 who fell, and who would not come to counsel with the call of Matzah the Lamb. And Enoch was burdened with the prospect that his lovely ones who gave their lives to his son would come to be hard pressed by the corruptions of evil, and that they would be left to feel alone and weak, because the Erkadeshi could not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, insomuch that there would be no end for their tolerance for the wicked. And Enoch saw from his dwelling place that Enoch had great determinations to find an element of righteousness that would protect the righteous and enable them to find support. And Enoch determined that he would divide the sons of men according to the measure of the holiness and sanctity of marriage. And he instructed the Erkadeshi plainly as to their limits in their tolerance for evil. And by his instruction, he set in motion the support of the Erkadeshi for the righteous. And in the days of Enoch, this day was called the day of instruction. But after Shem, it was called Shabuah. And thus we see that because the righteous gave their lives to Matzah the Lamb, he was able to intervene to instruct Enoch, so he may divide the sons of men, to gain comfort for his father Enoch in his burden, to know if his children would have support. And this day fell on a jubilee of days, from the day of the measure of Milo. And again, the Lord instructed Enoch, and he said, and there is a holy day in the memorable passages of my father, and it is called the Feast of Tranquility. And it is not a Sabbath, and 2 days before this day is a Sabbath. And on that day you shall have a place prepared where you sleep, and you shall make it fresh and new. And you shall have a pillow of pure linen, filled with clean and combed wool. So Enoch can lay his head down when he sleeps with you that night. And the day he sleeps with you is a Sabbath, and your hair may be down, for it is not a day when a person is held to account. And on the morrow you are to arise early in each of your encampments, and you are to select pure young maidens to dance before the inhabitants of your village. And they are to dance to the place where the Essebe is kept, and all of the women are to obtain Essebe. And it is to be ground with stones, even as Matzah the Lamb did for Kava, the day before the day of tranquility. And it is to be cooked with milk, and it is to be sweetened with honey, and do not withhold the honey to be miserly. And it is to have leavening, for it is the bread of peace. And then on the next day, which is a jubilee of days, from the day of instruction, you are to eat the bread in a feast. And the purpose of the bread is for you to be free from fear of intimidation, and you are to pray for one another and request from Enoch protection from fear. For that night the Erkadeshi shall issue forth to identify their own, and they shall suppress the fear and presence of Motzar the Decadent by a mighty hand, and woe unto those whom they ignore with their love. And the Lord rehearsed to him the memory of the agony and distress of heart of his father Enoch said, when in the midst of the peace and tranquility of Eden there came a shriek of fear to penetrate the stillness, and all of Elda and Eden and the host of the heavenly ones were filled with the dread and dismay of alarm. And in that day Matzah the Lamb was able to come to intervene in the face of their fear, and he caused the angels of heaven, who are called the Erkadeshi, to pass over in Eden to suppress Semihaza, and he met them in the place where they fled, and he slept with them. And on the morrow he brought the first protection elements known to man, and it was the Keli and the Keli bread. And the purpose of passage is to protect the righteous from fright and fear, and from harm, and the destructive forces of evil, and from lies, and from false visions, and from the effects of the works of darkness, and from the consequences of the temporal world when they are contrary to the will of Enoch said. And this can be because the first day of tranquility was established in the purity of the natural world of Eden. And thus Matzah the Lamb intervened again, being enabled by the acts of righteousness which occurred on the day of the measure of Milo. For Enoch said applies all of his holy days to all of his children, and this is very dear to the heart of Enoch said, for the protection of his lovely ones is magnified on that day, and his heart can rest from their being troubled with fear, and all of the holy host of heaven count the days with him from one holy day to the next. And again Matzah the Lamb spoke to Enoch, and he told him another account of the troubled heart of Enoch said, when all of the people everywhere were in the pains of hunger, and the wicked in all the northlands were in much want, as were the righteous also who dwelt there, and all of the lands of Anak, and the high places to the east, and the land of Rab Shalash, and also the encampment of Nod had the righteous in them in the distress of want. And Enoch saw it, and he knew of the day of which the Lord spoke. And Enoch saw the sorrow of Enoch said, and he was moved, and Matzah told him, I saw my father sorrowing as he traveled in the way, and I beheld him bent over in his grief. And I intervened to come before Icar, and I taught him how to plow, and the presence of my father rested in the plowed fields of the meadows and on the open plain. And it is a happy day in the regions of Elda with the holy host of heaven, and it is a day for the foundation of the storehouse, and the day of the celebration of Icar. And all of the righteous shall partake of the first fruits on the day in which they receive them with prayer and the joy of thankfulness. And in addition to that of this day, which is a jubilee of days from the day of tranquility, it is a day of rich thanksgiving and of joining the hearts of the righteous to the hearts of the Erkadeshi. And on that day all of the righteous shall feast, and the remaining first fruits shall be eaten, with the feeling that there is plenty for all. And the children shall rejoice and sing, and rich fellowship shall be obtained by the people rehearsing stories of the kindness of Enoch said, to provide for them in the storehouse. And repentance shall abound, and the element of righteousness shall be used to join the people with the Erkadeshi. And Abedel shall find instruction on the high places of the land concerning the desires of Enoch said in his heart, to have the righteous view creation as being their home and belonging to all the handiwork of his loving kindness. And it came to pass that again Enoch heard instruction in how to divide the days of men, and there was a day when Enoch said saw that the youth of Tawa and Heliah pursued a knowledge of mischief, and their fathers were of the corruption of Seku. And the heart of Enoch said was pained, and his eyes were filled with tears, to see their manner of raising of children among them. And he also worried when he saw the righteous having wayward children, and he was afraid that the workmanship of his hands would be led astray from one generation to another. And Matzah intervened again to call Enoch to the encampment of Masila, and to the barren waste places of the high plain in the east of Mahujah. And he brought Enoch dreams of instruction, so he could divide the waters of Senir. And this was so that every man would be born into the world to have a conscience, to know right from wrong and good from evil. And in this way the righteous could choose more easily to cling to virtue, and they could love their fellows and become members of the congregations of Moin. And thus came the day to celebrate that man is responsible to remember. And it was a jubilee of days from the day of the celebration of Icar. And on this day the rocks are called to remembrance, and all of the righteous eat together and rehearse to one another the testimony of their pathway to virtue, and to living together in the congregations of Moin, and their ability to speak plainly and truthfully shall be expanded on this day, and the gift of charity shall be embraced in the midst of all those who desire to be holy. And it came to pass that Matzah the Lamb continued to instruct Enoch in how to divide the days of men. And he said that there was a time when Enoch said was weary, and he was troubled in his soul. For it seemed sometimes that his children would not find their way to dwell with him. And his desire to dwell with his children is that which is foremost on the mind of the great Holy One. And Matzah the Lamb beheld the desires of his father, and he set a course to intervene, to establish a sure pathway for men to walk in, so they could fulfill the desires of his father, to dwell with his lovely ones. And when Yatzakad found the grief of despair in the face of the sins of his children, insomuch that he lost all hope of ever returning to Eden to dwell with Enochized, Matzah beheld it. And he stepped into the waters of the brook Baca to intervene with the covenant that he made with Gabriel. And he raised Yatzakad up when he was fallen down in his grief, and he named him Gabriel, and he covenanted before Enochized and Yatzakad in the presence of the rocks of witness, that Yatzakad and all of his righteous children would some day return to Eden to fill the desire of both their hearts. And with this covenant, the pathway back to Eden was come to dwell in both their hearts, and the division of days measures that pathway, and the celebration of new oil is a jubilee of days from the day of remembering virtue. And it is a day to bless the oil of the righteous, and it is a time to express thankfulness for the gift of life that can be led in the presence of the Holy One who lives in Eden. And it is a day when the congregations of the righteous are spoken to by Enochized, and they are guided in the way according to their needs from their kind Father. And it is a day for all of the longings of the righteous to live with their Father, to fulfill the desires of their hearts, to be expressed, and all of these longings are shared with him and with one another, and the desire for wickedness to be done away, and for righteousness to cover the earth will comfort, Enochized. And it is a day to pray for our loved ones who are bound down in the midst of the domain of the wicked, and the rocks of Ebedel shall be instructed concerning them, and they are to be anointed together with all of the people on that day. And it came to pass that Matzah continued to instruct Enoch according to the division of days. And he told him that since the day that Yatzakad and Kava sinned in Eden, and since they passed through the oaks of Patak, they were not happy and content, and the heart of their father was moved with sorrow, and he wept. And Matzah came to them soon after their day of sorrow began, and he came to forgive them and to instruct them in the way they should go. And he made them clothes, and he went with them, and he gave the elements of righteousness freely to them, and he healed them and touched them to comfort them, but they still were unhappy. And in this way Matzah tried to prevent this sorrow, and he even slept with them to bring the comfort of a tender father, but they were unhappy still. And the sorrow of Enochized remained to linger in his heart, to burden him down, he being a tender parent who wants his children to be happy. So once again, the hero of all men intervened, and Matzah called upon the Erkadeshi to help him. and Shamiel offered to help, and she spoke to Yatakar and Kava, and they together brought the living waters of understanding and happiness and rich forgiveness. And when Kava heard that there would be a measure of grace for her little Kenna, she rose up in the dance with her life restored to her, and her joy and happiness abounded. And Yatsakad was filled with the Spirit, and he praised Enoch said in that day. And the richness of the Spirit of forgiveness flooded over them, and they became happy and content, and their souls held the living water. And it was the day of forgiveness, and it is the last holy day of the year, and it is a jubilee of days after the celebration of new oil, and a jubilee of days after the day of forgiveness is the last day of the year. And this is a day to celebrate the life-giving powers of forgiveness, and it is a day to teach and instill in the people the love of repentance, and a day to acknowledge the rightful place of the Erkadeshi in your lives. And it is a day to make gentle words of forgiveness to one another, and a day for the men of Ishuad to set in motion the purifications of healing in relationships and in families, and peace and reconciliation shall preside in the hearts of the righteous. And in a sabbatical year it is the day of release. And it came to pass that Matzah the Lamb said to Enoch, "It is my great desire that you divide the days of the sons of men and establish it, and that you give the establishment of it to my father, to comfort him in the way. For he loves to share his passages with his children, and all of these holy days are dear to his heart, and he counts the days until he can worship and fellowship in rich communion with his children. And each holy day represents to him specific intervention that I was enabled to make because of the day of the measure of Milo. And my father is steadfast, and he does not forget any of the holy days, and all of the Erkadeshi celebrate them with him. And up to this day, he has had to celebrate them alone with regard to the children of men. And in his heart he applies these days to all of his children. And these are days for the righteous to bond with Enoch said, and to comfort him and minister to him in all of the desires of his heart. And there are 7 holy days, and the day of the new year, and for 2 days you shall sleep with him at the new year and the day of tranquility. And for 2 days you shall eat with him at the celebration of Ikar and the day of forgiveness. And for 2 days you shall walk with him at the celebration of new oil and the day of measure of Milo. And for 2 days you shall labor with him for the day of instruction and the day of remembering virtue. And you shall keep his pillow clean and sacred in all of your dwelling places. And you shall make dishes for him to eat on and to drink from. And they are also to be kept clean and sacred in your dwelling places. And on the day of remembering virtue, you shall labor all that day long, doing special labors of love for one another. And with Enoch said, and all of the activities of this holy day shall be done the day before, so that on that day it will be only a day to labor in love for him and one another. And on the days you walk with him and you work with him, you are to speak to him aloud concerning your activities all through the day. Be not ashamed to hear one another speaking to him aloud on these 2 days. And the very Father of heaven and earth will be at your side. And you will see that the holy days of your year begin by giving your lives to Matzah the Lamb. Then because of this, he can intervene to bless and comfort his Father together with you. And your year ends with the overflowing forces and blessings of rich forgiveness, only to begin the sacred cycle again. And these days will be spent in rich fellowship. And thus has the division of days now come to you in the richness of the first great 70. Thank you, family, for joining us. That is the end of chapter 13. Thank you, Great Holy One, for blessing us with the gift of life another day. We thank you for your loving kindness endures forever. Thank you. In the name of Matzah the Lamb and Kai, the Holy Spirit, so be it. Blessings, family. Shalom.